Good evening, and on behalf of the Institute for Human Ecology, welcome to the Catholic University of America. My name is Emmett McGroarty. I'm Director of Research and Planning for the Institute of Human Ecology. The Institute is committed to increasing the understanding of the conditions of human flourishing, the relationships of human beings with each other in the natural world. We're co-hosting tonight's event with the university's Intelligence Studies program. Its director, Nicholas Dujmovic, will moderate tonight's discussion. Prior to joining the university's politics department, Professor Dujmovic served for 26 years with the Central Intelligence Agency, for which his various posts included analyst on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, speechwriter for the director, and editor of the President's Daily Brief. Following the discussion, we'll have a brief Q&A and then refreshments over on this side of the room. Professor?
Thank you, Emmett. It's great to see all of you. There's nothing that can turn out people like intelligence or how the media reports things, and here we have both. Once again, I'm indebted to the university's Institute for Human Ecology for its vital support of this, our fifth co-sponsored event. This series of events, as well as the academic program I direct, emphasize American intelligence. And we bring in intelligence professionals, former and current, and also others concerned about the national security, to discuss not only how intelligence actually works to enhance our country's security, but also the impact of intelligence activities on people, on our society, on our culture, and increasingly now on our politics. We've discussed the ethics of intelligence in covert action, technical collection, and espionage. And we ask questions such as, are U.S. intelligence activities conducted in accordance with American values and moral standards that Americans are comfortable with? For this fifth event, we turn to the subject of intelligence accountability, and specifically the media's role. Students of intelligence here at Catholic University learn about the classic elements of intelligence: collection in its various forms, analysis, counterintelligence, covert action. And they also learn that an essential element of intelligence serving a democracy is that it be held accountable. Accountability is a vital element. As I used to tell in my previous life, I used to tell new CIA employees that we cannot on the one hand enjoy our freedoms as US citizens of this great country, and on the other hand wish as intelligence officers that somehow we didn't have so many restraints. Can't have it both ways. We actually should want US intelligence to be accountable. This accountability happens mainly, of course, through established vehicles of oversight, especially the intelligence oversight committees of the Congress, the House and the Senate, but also through mechanisms of executive and judicial oversight. These all help ensure intelligence accountability to the Constitution, to the law, through our elected officials. Ultimately, however, U.S. intelligence has to be accountable to the American people. As William Colby, the former CIA director, noted in 1978, a public informed about intelligence accomplishments and capabilities will support it. A public aware of its true mission and the limits of its authority will accept it. A public that understands the issues and problems of intelligence will debate and decide them. So the premise of this panel is that the media, journalists, the Fourth Estate, have a role to play in accountability by informing the public. And this is actually difficult for a former career intelligence officer to say. That role, I've come to believe, is usually positive. There, I said it. Usually positive, which means sometimes not. I'm delighted to have assembled a group of usually positive journalists, all distinguished veterans whose work I've been reading, in some cases for many years. All are deeply interested in intelligence and know a lot about it. Julian Barnes covers national security issues for the New York Times from its Washington bureau, most recently on the IC whistleblower story. He has been reporting on U.S. military and national security topics for more than 17 years, including for the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, and U.S. News and World Report. Steve Coll is the dean of the Columbia Journalism School. He spent 20 years at the Washington Post as a correspondent and ultimately as managing editor. And he continues as a staff writer for The New Yorker. He has won too many awards to list here, but one of his 2 Pulitzer Prizes was for a book that even CIA officers thought was really good. Ghost Wars, The Secret History of the CIA, Afghanistan, and bin Laden from the Soviet invasion to September 10th, 2001, and he's followed that up with a well-regarded sequel, Directorate S. We're grateful to Dean Coll for taking the time to come down from New York. He has to leave a little bit early, so when he does, it's not, I hope, a judgment on what has been going on. Peter Finn is the national security editor at the Washington Post. He has served bureau chief in Warsaw, Berlin, and Moscow. It would be interesting to be station chief there. And as a national security correspondent covering the Kosovo conflict and the Iraq War, the latter while embedded with U.S. Special Forces. So he's a snake eater. As national security editor, he oversaw the Post's Pulitzer Prize-winning reporting on the Snowden revelations about U.S. technical collection and on Russian election interference. He is the co-author of a book about a CIA covert operation to use a Russian novel as a weapon in the Cold War. I reviewed it very favorably because it's an excellent book, and not just to get Peter on this panel. Ellen Nakashima is a veteran national security reporter for the Washington Post covering intelligence, counterterrorism, and cybersecurity. She has served as a correspondent in Southeast Asia. Her reporting and that of colleagues on government surveillance revealed by the former IC contractor Snowden received the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting. More recently, she was part of a team that won the Pulitzer Prize on the Russian election interference story. And the Post, I just noticed, ran her story just today or yesterday about the arrest of a U.S. citizen in California charged with espionage on behalf of Beijing. I also learned that she has co-authored a political biography of Al Gore. I got to read that. So for tonight, I will pose questions to our panelists. These will be intended to spark some discussion, and we all look forward to your insights. Thank you for being here on such a news-heavy day. Towards the end, we'll give the audience to ask the opportunity to ask questions as well. And I'm going to move now to my chair. I'd like to start by asking each of our panelists to reflect on how he or she first got involved in reporting on U.S. intelligence and what's the most challenging thing covering that beat. So why don't we start with Julian?
I am, this is right, it is. So about a year and a half ago, I came back from Brussels where I was working on covering Russian aggression, NATO, and other sort of military, hard-edged national security issues for the Wall Street Journal, and I moved over to the New York Times to take on the intelligence beat, which I have to say is probably one of the most difficult beats I've ever handled. You know, most times when you talk to people, the answer is, I can't say, and that's, you know, often they won't even take your call. Sometimes when I ask a question, people will stop me. Do not finish that question. I do not want to hear it. Stop. And so compared to even other kinds of national security reporting, military reporting, you might hear about an operation before it goes on, and then you will have to wait until it is after it's complete, but that's usually a matter of days. And you know, the sort of issues in intelligence reporting, sometimes you hear about something and the security concerns around that are going to last for years. It may be that a story that you want to write, you can never write, or if they're arguing someone's life is in danger, if you print that, that is not something that goes away in 2 days. That's something that continues for a while. So that's where I would leave it.
Thank you.
Well, I guess I got into it. I hadn't thought about it, but kind of through the back door. I was sent to South Asia by the Washington Post as a foreign correspondent, and one of the big stories on my beat was the CIA covert action program run through Pakistan to try to defeat the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. I came in at kind of the tail end of that, but it was a big running story for the Washington Post. A lot of our subscribers were involved in this in one way or another, and so I started covering it in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. I became sort of obsessive with particularly the role of Pakistani intelligence in shaping the politics of the resistance and privileging more radical groups over more kind of traditional ones. And then toward the end of my tour, a Pakistani intelligence officer in Pakistan wrote a memoir about how it all really worked. And I read it with fascination, and I invited him, met him in a hotel in Dusseldorf, Germany, and just ran the tape recorder for like 3 days and just downloaded everything he knew about what the CIA did, how the whole system worked. And then I went back to Washington and started interviewing, and for the first time I called CIA Public Affairs. I didn't even know they had a public affairs office, never mind that someone would answer the phone. And I said, look, I've got all this stuff. I'm going to write a big, 2-part series about how it worked and what some of the controversies inside of it were. But it would be a much better story if you would, listen to my questions. And after some back and forth, they did invite me in to meet a couple of people who had been involved. I was a little bit unclear about who they were, which was a little bit unsettling because it didn't really seem like a very reliable way to develop sources. But yeah, so I published that, and that was the first time I dealt with the agency as an institution. In terms of the challenge, it's hard because it's a secret organization and it doesn't operate transparently, although it does have a pretty robust public affairs office. And there was an era, in the Tenet era, when there was a guy named Bill Harlow who was the head of public affairs. He was sort of a gruff former Navy officer. He's still around, but he had this tone on the kind of mumbled on the phone, but he would take calls and he would sometimes be helpful. And a colleague of mine tells the story, just pressing him, why can't you tell me that? And he said, because we're a secret organization. Anyway, it's still a struggle in that respect.
Well, I was in Berlin as the bureau chief on September 10th, 2001, covering Central and Eastern Europe. The following day, obviously, the attacks happened, and everything I had been doing was over. Within a few days, I was in Mohammed Atta's apartment in Hamburg, and then I was thrust into covering Al-Qaeda, terrorism, counterterrorism, and I began then to develop relationships with European, North African, Gulf intelligence services as I did this beat for the next 3 years or so. So that kind of led me into it through a back door. Then I went to Russia. I think I had one brief meeting with the FSB and never spoke to them again, though I know they were, tapping my phone and all of that. That's pretty standard. But I did try and harass them periodically because I would give my phone to my 14-year-old daughter so that they would have hours and hours of, did you see him? He's so cute.
You write that technique down.
Yeah. Anyway, after my Russian posting was over, I came back to Washington as a national security correspondent covering Guantanamo Bay, U.S. detention operations, and I never directly covered the Central Intelligence Agency. That was never my job, but I've been dealing with intelligence services since 9/11.
So while Peter was overseas in Berlin and then in Moscow, I and my husband, who's also a journalist at the Washington Post, we were posted to Jakarta in Southeast Asia, 2002 to 2006. And we got there just a couple of months before the first big Bali bombing that killed a number of Westerners and sort of launched me on sort of beat of covering militant Islam in Southeast Asia and Jamaat Islamiyah. So I got a taste of doing some intelligence work there. And then we also, but besides covering terrorism and SARS and bird flu, or my beat, I used to say, was disasters and war and pestilence. I remember going to Aceh, which was the site of where the Indian Ocean tsunami had hit in 2014, and doing a one-year anniversary story in December of 2015, and driving along Aceh in a small remote area in this car with a driver, and the driver had the radio on. I think it was VOA, Voice of America, and I heard this broadcast about some big news breaking back in America of a warrantless wiretapping program by the National Security Agency, and I just remember being floored by it, stunned, thousands of miles away in Aceh, Indonesia, thinking, what is our government doing? And a few months later, I returned to Washington. By now, my tour was over, and I was now assigned to the financial staff covering privacy, technology, and security issues. And this was the middle of 2006, so second Bush, we're in the George W. Bush administration, second term, full-on war on terror, and there were so many rich issues and stories to dive into that had to do with the ways in which our government was exploiting technology in the name of security to keep us safe from another terrorist attack, but which had tremendous privacy implications. And in fact, I started, through sort of a backdoor way, covering the big debate that happened nationally and on the Hill after the New York Times broke the warrantless wiretapping program, which turned into this whole debate on the Hill over how to overhaul our surveillance laws, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Got to know then more of the players, especially in the National Security Agency as well as on the Hill. And that would be, I would say, my first real taste of covering intelligence as a policy issue. And then a few years later, there was another big story which came with the Snowden leaks. And at that point, everything kind of came together. I was covering cybersecurity as well, so cyber, surveillance, privacy issues, and just how do we as a nation grapple with what are the proper boundaries between surveillance and privacy and security. Those were the issues that were kind of consuming me. And I would say that's pretty much been a lot of my focus for much of the last 10 years. And as far as the most challenging aspect of it, it's sort of as Julian and Steve and Peter have said, it's really learning what's going on when these are secret programs, often maybe covert programs that the operators are not supposed to talk about. If they do, they could lose their jobs. And you're trying to get this information because you believe it is in the public's interest to know what the government is doing and whether they are doing it according to the law, and not just according to the law because the law might allow them to do it, not just can they do it, but should they do it. And so finding out those stories and protecting our sources, because that's very important to us as journalists.
Very good. Thank you. Continuing with the softball questions. Peter Finn, you authored an excellent book on intelligence by using declassified CIA documents. And it's interesting to me how journalists develop an expertise in intelligence, which by its nature, and it's a feature, not a bug, tries to cloak its activities in secrecy. How important was it to your project to learn how to get CIA to cough up documents?
Well, it took a long time. It took probably 2 to 3 years. I had written about Dr. Zhivago and Boris Pasternak while I was in Russia as a correspondent. And there had been a rumor for 50 years that the CIA was behind a Russian language edition of Dr. Zhivago that was smuggled back into the Soviet Union, but it was completely unacknowledged. I thought the story around, not just that, but the whole story of the publication and the repression of Pasternak inside the Soviet Union, the award of the Nobel Prize, the isolation of Pasternak, and then his subsequent death a short time later. I thought it was just a fantastic story. It had been told in various forms, but not as a single narrative. But I thought if I'm going to do this, there has to be a new element. And the new element I felt was the agency. So I literally wrote a memo, gave it to Public Affairs saying, I'd like to do this. I believe you guys were behind this. Look, here are all these references and rumors, etc. They rejected it out of hand initially. I then went to some formers, and there were lots of former officers around town, interested a couple of them in the project. They then spoke to people inside who spoke to the historians. And the agency itself, then I began to think, this is actually a great story. It's a great story for us, so why not tell it? And eventually, after 2.5 years, in my mailbox arrived this package of declassified documents. This is like a year before they put them up on the website. They simply mailed them to me.
Did you have to file a formal FOIA? Or
No, because I knew that just wasn't going to get me anywhere.
Yeah, you have to know what you're looking for fairly specifically. Steve Coll, you once said that writing a book on ExxonMobil was a lot harder than writing about CIA and bin Laden. I'm very curious about why you would say that.
Well, because I think the CIA, in the way that Peter just described, like a lot of institutions in Washington, it sees that it has long-term institutional interests in having, as you said in your opening remarks, the public understand what it does, how it does it, and certainly, to publicize its successes, but also just the complexity of its work, and when there are big public failures, to get its side of the story on the record. So these are long-term kind of, I don't want to overdo it, but they're sort of like survival strategies in Washington. You want your place in the system to be understood so that you can succeed at the mission you believe in. And so that requires communication. ExxonMobil doesn't believe that about their business. That's the difference with ExxonMobil, which it's a whole other subject. They don't believe that any information about their internal operations is actually fomenting their long-term business success in the same way that, it's not just CIA, but FBI and the Pentagon and every other big semi-permanent institution in the national security bureaucracy operates in its own way. Some of them, I find that it goes through seasons where there's an openness to this strategy and there are smart people guiding it, and then you get other seasons where there's not an openness to it and you really just have a kind of slam down the phone era of public affairs. It can go both ways.
Many intelligence officers, if I can speak for them, believe that the media should limit itself to reporting on 3 areas of intelligence. First, U.S. intelligence missions and which agencies carry them out. Secondly, the foreign threat and challenges faced by U.S. intelligence, and immediate crises or events that warrant informing the public. In other words, limited to informational, neutral, and even reactive stories rather than anything investigative or judgmental. I imagine our panelists would not leave it at that, but let's talk for a minute about this rule and simply informing the public about what's going on. Ellen, you had a great story recently about this U.S. citizen in California who was picked up, which it's an interesting story because not only of the, sort of the fact of Chinese intelligence working in the United States, but also it was a dandy explanation of a double agent operation where our side dangles information as bait in order to catch spies. So how important is this sort of purely informational reporting?
So this story actually came out as a result of an unsealed criminal complaint in San Francisco, so the Northern District of California, and it was part of the Justice Department, this administration's effort actually to really become more aggressive in pursuing what they consider to be a growing Chinese threat in terms of both traditional espionage, like this individual we wrote about, as well as economic espionage, or stealing commercial secrets through cyber hacks or just in person. And so it is, it is important to surface this, and I think it's also important to try to get at the larger and deeper trends here, and not just what it is that the U.S. government is putting out, but I mean, exactly how significant and severe is this threat? Because there is some debate and pushback from some quarters that our U.S. government may be overreaching a little in going after these Chinese spies, and may in fact be stigmatizing some in the Chinese community and academia or whatnot. So it's a balancing act in trying to surface these clear national security threats, as well as make sure that the U.S. government is not, undertaking a campaign maybe because they feel that there's a threat from the Chinese community.
Do any of you ever feel like, in a sense, by the informational aspect of reporting on intelligence, you're actually, in a sense, doing a favor for U.S. intelligence agencies? Because that's been an accusation that American media, mainstream media, is too much in bed with the national security state. You often end up being cheerleaders, and often not. But how do you feel about that? When you're doing the purely informational reporting, do you ever reflect on who that is really for?
Your turn. I think it's your turn.
It's my turn. To your larger question of this perception that journalists in Washington are too cozy with national security professionals or looking uncritically. I think that's very important to always to keep that criticism in mind. I think it's the journalism is only performing its role when we are asking hard questions, when we are looking at both sides. On the other hand, there is an expertise to mine, and that there is not just an accountability, but an information role, an educational role for journalism, and that's part of it too. But I think it's important to keep both missions in mind every day as you're doing your daily reporting.
Well, I would just add a couple of things. I think it's really important that what we do in Washington is balanced with what we're doing in other parts of the world. So that, for instance, if we're relying exclusively on what we can learn here about, say, drone operations in Pakistan or Afghanistan, that's wholly inadequate. We need to be out there talking to people on the ground, talking about civilian casualties, talking about collateral damage. You can lose sight of all of these things when you're sitting in Washington or sitting in a military base and you're not doing that other kind of reporting as well. And that requires, collaboration across the newsroom between the national security staff and the foreign staff, and that's something, we've always attempted to cultivate.
So let's talk about the public's right to know, which is the mantra, it seems, of journalism, and whether there are limits on it. If we speak of the public's right to know or its need to know. Veteran, legendary Post reporter Chalmers Johnson explained that he and other reporters in the late 1950s knew about the development of the U-2 spy plane, but chose not to report it because, he said, we took the position that the national interest came before the story. Now, is that a quaint echo of a bygone past? Can you imagine sitting on a story like that today?
Well, I think there are echoes of that in what I assume is still newsroom practice at all the major newsrooms. Certainly was when I was managing editor, which I'll circle around to in a second. But let's just answer the big question, what is the public's right to know? Because it is established law in the United States exactly what the parameters are. In the Pentagon Papers case, the Supreme Court established that the government does have a right to stop you from publishing stuff, but only in the most extreme circumstances that no one has yet been able to imagine. So they may revise that standard in the future, but for now, we are not a country of the Official Secrets Act. We're not a country, and Australia has the same kind of tradition. So there's a lot of industrialized democracies that do allow the government to preempt publication on national security or other grounds. We're not one of them. So that actually uncomfortably transfers the responsibility for deciding what the public has a right to know to a free society, to a free press, and to newsrooms. Now, there were bygone days. What's quaint about the Chalmers-Johnson era was that it was pre-social media, it was pre-WikiLeaks, it was pre-North Korean hacks dumped onto the internet, and you really did have meaningful gatekeepers in every one of the major newsrooms whose decisions would shape whether or not the public knew something like the operations at the U-2. So in thinking about responsibilities that Peter carries out now, and along with colleagues at the Post, you have to recognize you're in an era of radical structural transparency, and yet at the same time, at least my own philosophy is you've got to be responsible for your own decisions. You make your own decisions on your own grounds, on your own principles. And I would just end by saying the way you usually decide, at least turn it to Peter, but usually you decide is by a method of consultation and deliberation that usually involves groups of people inside the newsroom and often dialogue with the government party that's objecting to the publication of this or that. You listen, you think, you deliberate, and then you apply a kind of case law standard, which is what is actually the public interest here? What disclosure serves the public interest here? And sometimes, reporters will get very excited about technical details that they've learned that might be extraneous to the public disclosure, but which could be published, but often are withheld because they're not germane to the public interest purpose of bringing a story forward. But each case, you're trying to apply that principle to cases that vary from day to day, from month to month, from year to year. The context always changes. And so there's really no other way to do it than the way judges apply principles to diverse sets of facts.
Can I just jump in a little, because I know Peter can talk more to this too, I think the Snowden disclosures just are a rich case study in this very issue. The very first story was published by Glenn Greenwald in The Guardian, and it was, as you probably all remember, the story about the Section 215 big phone metadata collection that the NSA was carrying on with the help of major telephone companies. And the reason that story actually got out was that Snowden had leaked a copy of the actual FISA court order to Verizon that said, you shall transmit all phone records in your possession basically every day to the NSA, millions and millions of records. So that story created a tremendous controversy and national debate, and I would argue it is the one, perhaps the best example of a leak that was in the national interest because it surfaced an issue of how the law that Congress had passed was actually being interpreted secretly by a court to authorize this mass collection of Americans' phone records. It's just the who called whom and the duration of the call, not the content. And the government, had its justification that, look, that we're not collecting content, we're only looking at this for tips to try to find out who might be calling who's related to a terrorist. But because this program had been secret and the interpretation of the law so stretched the meaning of the law in a shocking way, it became a huge national controversy. And I think even former DNI Jim Clapper had said, maybe in retrospect, we should have had this debate publicly in the beginning, right? And could have avoided this long national sort of heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching debate. Then there were other disclosures that that came out through Snowden that, some would argue, I think Clapper would argue, actually had more of a deleterious effect in some cases, causing the loss of communications, or they went dark on terrorists who were being tipped off to the ways in which the government was eavesdropping on them. But we at the Washington Post, because thanks to one of our colleagues, Bart Gellman, were the recipients of a large portion of these documents. And we reported on, or even reprinted, just a tiny, tiny fraction of them. And there was we had a huge a process for deciding which of these documents would actually be worth, or in the public interest and worth reporting on and turning into stories that involve the sort of consultation that Steve mentioned within the Post, with editors, and then with editors, reporters, and the intelligence community, so that they had a chance to know in advance what we thought was relevant, what we're going to publish. Did they have any concerns about national security, and if so, what were they? And then there was this process of deliberation to decide what to withhold, if anything, or what not. And there were cases when we did withhold certain details that we were convinced might be harmful to either an operation or a source or method. There were other times when we didn't. But it's not that we just get big data dumps from someone like Edward Snowden and then print everything we get. Not at all.
Yeah, I would just add that there are these informal mechanisms to discuss these issues when they arise. There's a whole spectrum from a phone call from someone at CIA Public Affairs to a reporter saying, you shouldn't do X, to them deciding they need to talk to me, to them deciding they need to talk to the executive editor. And the higher it goes, the more serious the issue is. There have been instances when I've had to go out to Langley to sit down with people to discuss a story. And I find that for the most part, at least until recently, the intelligence community had a fairly sophisticated, mature approach to these issues. They understood that they couldn't kill a story, but they would point out particular instances where if they said we could endanger a life, then we had to take that very seriously, and we might remove certain details from a story. With the Snowden documents, there were wide-ranging and ongoing discussions among ourselves, and then discussions between senior editors and senior intelligence officials, where each side presented its point of view. But in the end, because of the society we live in, it is the responsibility and it is the right of the press to make the final decision. It's not like the intelligence community can dictate to us what will not be in the paper, but we do take very seriously what they say, and we, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, have particular responsibilities because we have these relationships in Washington. But then, there are other parts of the media where huge amounts of documents are dumped, and then we have to, and this is a whole other discussion, what is our responsibility then when it's just wantonly put out there?
You can give them back?
No.
No.
We don't give them back.
Okay. Well, I just wonder, you mentioned when a human life is at stake. And I wonder if there are categories of information that you already have either ruled out or would consider not publishing because I have this quote from Catherine Graham of the Washington Post. She said there are some things the general public does not need to know and shouldn't. Is that something you can determine ahead of time, or is it ad hoc every time?
So for me, when I talk to a government official about who is asking me to withhold something, the best argument to withhold it is tell me it's wrong. The next argument that I think certainly gives me a huge amount of pause, pushes me over to a do not publish, is there is a human life at stake. But we also get arguments where it is embarrassing or politically inconvenient or will strain relations with allies. And these are very important to people within the government sometimes, but they're not very persuasive to journalists, to editors. And sniffing out what the real reasons are that somebody is going to that pretty large step of asking you to withhold information that you have gathered from the public when your role is to inform the public and to give the public information, you know, you need to really figure out what that reason is.
Yeah, I think that sounds very familiar. One of the frustrating parts of that dialogue, I think, on the journalist side is that very senior government officials will just say, you have to trust us, you're really going to damage this country, or you have to trust us, people are going to be put into harm's way. And you have to say, well, I'm not persuaded by that. I also know the facts of this matter and the context in which the publishing would take place. So can you just provide a little more evidence to support your generalized point of view that this is damaging? And I think in those cases that we can now look back on with full knowledge of the record and we can document the dialogue that went back and forth, the fact of the matter was there wasn't a lot of evidence on the other side. There was an instinct, there was a sense of differing views about what the best course of action was in this case, but it wasn't in fact the case that there was concrete path to harm to someone. I think there's more than just putting people in harm's way, which I think is clearly for myself would be a basis to withdraw a story from publication until I was quite sure that we weren't putting someone in harm's way, or that there was some extraordinary hard to imagine reason why that wouldn't trump publication. But also I think for myself, I'm comfortable withholding, as in Ellen's example, all sorts of details of national security operations that are ongoing that are not germane to the public interest matter of policy, of law, of constitutional rights that the story you're working on exposes. I'll give you one example. When I was managing editor, I was the number 2 editor. I supported the executive editor in making the final decision. But for some reason, I don't know why it was, I was on duty and he was away. And it was about 10 days after 9/11. And we had somehow, I don't remember which reporter did, we discovered on a Saturday that the CIA was flying surveillance drone operations out of Uzbekistan over Afghanistan. This was, before the war had started in Afghanistan. And they had been flying these actually for some time, as it turned out, a year and a half, and they were looking for bin Laden and al-Qaeda leadership. And through the kind of ordinary course of a weekend duty decision-making thing, this thing was going in the paper on Sunday. And I got a call from John McLaughlin, who was the deputy director of the CIA. He said, look, if you publish this, all of those operations are going to cease because the Uzbeks are going to withdraw permission. The whole deal is based on our keeping this confidential, and they're not going to understand that you're an independent newspaper. They're just going to think we're screwing them. So, that was easy to pull it back for a couple of days while we had a chance to get into the office on Monday and think about what we had and how we wanted to handle it. The result of that discussion, I haven't gone back and looked at the story that we then did like 3 days later, but the result of the discussion was to decide after some deliberation and dialogue with the CIA that the fact that the United States was in bed with this brutal police state in order to run these counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan, that was news. That was publicly important. But the exact form of that intelligence cooperation initially we decided to withhold. So we basically wrote a story about how the U.S. had really changed its policy towards Uzbekistan, what the human rights situation in Uzbekistan was, what the cooperation that the U.S. was giving meant to empower this dictator, and that the operations involved counterterrorism relevant to the 9/11 attacks. And I think we kind of left it there for a while. Eventually, the whole story of the drone operations came out. But that would be a typical case law decision of a process like that.
Quick story about what happens sometimes when you delay. After the Bin Laden raid, I had nailed that the stealth drone had been used to fly over the Abbottabad compound, and that's how the Obama was running it real time. And I was told by the Pentagon that this would endanger the capability, and we shouldn't publish it. So we took it back in that sort of deliberative process to think about it. And then I looked at the Washington Post the next day, and Greg Miller had broken it, and I'm like, oh dear, there goes the scoop.
And that anticipates my next question, which is about competition. You know, the Washington Post does the right thing and delays the story for a few days, and then the Times jumps on it, or vice versa. Just looking at the Pulitzer Prize website, it's very instructive to see the competition that is manifest there.
You don't harbor any competitive feelings towards the Times or the Wall Street Journal, do you, Peter?
Yeah. Well, can you speak about this competition and how it drives the publication of intelligence stories?
You're on the front lines. You're fighting it every day.
Yeah, I think it's a major driver. None of us like to get beaten by the other. And we're all out there, working sources, talking to people, trying to develop information, trying to confirm it, trying to get it into publishable form, so that we can get it out first, because, a large part of what we do and want to do, and you can argue the merits of this, is to be first. That's a big driver in journalism. We're watching what our competitors are doing. We're trying to anticipate what they're doing. We're trying to figure out what they're doing, and we're trying to get there ahead of them.
After having been beaten many times by Ellen and Greg and all the colleagues, one of the things I'm doing when I have a controversial story that requires, deliberation by pay grades above me, by the senior editors, I'm also trying to determine what the footsteps are. I'm trying to tell the editors, you have a decision space here. You have got some time to think about this. And that's a hard thing to do, because you really don't know, and we always think the Washington Post is about to get our scoop. And I am trying to figure out, are others on this? I want to give the editors time to sort of think about this and convene and discuss, rather than just leap into the fray.
So is it possible that this competitive situation results in maybe something going out that maybe on reflection could have been held back? Does that ever happen?
I don't know. I wonder what you guys would say. I think these three newsrooms, the Times, the Post, the Wall Street Journal, for all of the competitive juices that flow, for all of the disappointments and going home and, popping open a beer after you've gotten beaten on something that you might not have gotten beaten on, they're in it for the long run. Their mantra is they'd rather be right than first. Speed is also a ticket to making mistakes, and those are much more costly than losing a particular incremental story to a rival. And so I don't think it's quite that desperate a situation. There's another advantage of the competition that's probably more apparent to journalists than to audiences, which is that well-resourced, well-run, ethically driven, but highly competitive newsrooms, having more than one of them, actually keeps each of the newsrooms honest. Because, newsrooms get off track sometimes. They start following a line of a story that, just is missing something, is misguided in some way. And then it's always happening in the other newsrooms is like, let's examine the opposite of their assumptions and see if it applies, and see if there's another angle to that story. And I think for me as a reader of this kind of journalism now, to have the Post come back in the way that it has, and to hold the is part about holding the power of the Times, which is becoming a global, juggernaut, to hold the Times accountable and to have as many different kinds of newsrooms trying to decide what stories matter, what stories to resource, and how to manage the publishing dilemmas that arise.
So Ellen and I are in fierce competition on the cyber beat. She is beating me right now, I can say, but we've each had our victories. But I think if you look at our reporting over the last year, we are building on each other's stories. We are course correcting a little bit too. She finds something in my reporting that's not as accurate. My next go around on it, not inaccurate, but could be refined. I am seeing what she is saying. I'm rechecking, and I think you see the two in competition, us pushing toward the truth, pushing for the public to know something they need to know about how the government is defending the sort of election infrastructure, one of the foundations of our democracy. And so within this competition, we are building on each other's work.
Sort of an iterative process there. I also wanted to just pick up on something Steve mentioned about the resurgence of the Post, and I think a lot of it is due to our editor, Marty Baron, who's just been terrific. And in highly competitive stories like the Russia one was a few years ago and like the whistleblower Ukraine story is today, I mean, he loves to get scoops, he likes us to be first, but he is also he has standards, and he won't let us publish unless we feel we've nailed it. We need to have usually at least 2 reliable, credible sources on a specific sort of significant assertion or fact we're reporting before we'll go with it. And I don't think I'm betraying anything, Peter, right? To say that, for instance, this past week where we were breaking some stories, first about the fact that the whistleblower complaint had to do with a foreign leader and President Trump and a promise made. And then we reported that it had to do with Ukraine. And of course, everyone sort of assumed this had to do with President Zelensky, who had a July 25th phone call, but we didn't quite have the 2 sources to go with it. And as much as we would have liked to have gotten that out first, Marty rightfully said, no, we won't go with say just one source. And so we got scooped by the Wall Street Journal, I guess, who actually had a really great story about how Trump pressed Zelensky not just once, but something like 8 times, 9 times on the phone call.
But is that in the transcript? Let's see. I was thinking about that. I was counting. I didn't see it.
Don't use the number. Multiple times.
There was the ellipsis. Did you see the ellipsis? There were 7 times.
But I don't want to be relying on the ellipsis.
When we're talking about this kind of competition, we're talking about the intersection of politics and intelligence. We're not talking about a pure intelligence operation where I think that's a much slower form of reporting. You get shards of information, you put it together over a period of time. Mm-hmm. This story is as much about politics as it is about intelligence, both the Russia story and the Ukraine story.
And I hope you will be covering how the IC is being dragged into politics on this. It's very interesting how Democrats in Congress are now among the biggest champions of intelligence for political reasons. But before we get to the IC whistleblower, I wanted to circle back to Snowden. And Ellen, you and a colleague wrote a story a few years ago based on Snowden documents about offensive U.S. cyber operations. Contain many details about targets, methods, numbers of operations, specific programs, and specific units at CIA and NSA that I didn't know were in the public domain when I read it the other day. None of this has to do with civil liberties or the ability to spy on Americans. It all has to do with capabilities. And Peter, you oversaw the editing of this. I mean, is it possible that such reporting can help our adversaries?
Well, part of it was, I think, this was the first time that anyone had really ever, in the public, seen the so-called black budget and the justifications, really, for the spending that is going on in the intelligence community on some of these programs. And I know Bart Gelman, who was the co-writer and lead author on the story, did run he ran by the NSA and CIA the points that he was taking, we were taking from the budget by them, and said, push back if you feel any one of these in particular is going to harm a specific capability. And, to my knowledge, you probably know better than I don't think we got any blowback after the story ran.
No, I don't think so. I would just, on a small point of information, I wouldn't say I oversaw. I was one of the editors on the Snowden Coverage. There were many cooks in that particular kitchen. But this process of consultation does take place. And there is a permanent tension between journalists and the intelligence community, but it's not like we are blindly publishing material. And I think most of the time, the agency is able to reconcile itself to what has been put out there because they are aware of what has not.
May I also just say one thing about cyber in particular, which Julian well knows? Cyber is one of the most secretive areas in intelligence reporting, and I think Mike Hayden likes to say it's so secretive because its bloodlines go back to the most secretive agency in the US government, the National Security Agency. This is where the cyber capabilities were really born and honed. And because of that, I think unnecessarily so, this secrecy has hampered a better public understanding of what the U.S. government's, the use of cyber is. And so people kind of create their own myths and project onto the NSA and CIA sometimes all of these capabilities or these things that sometimes the agencies really don't even have. And it's harder to hold these agencies accountable when you don't understand what they're using these weapons for. It came out that we used cyber, or the NSA used a cyber tool to help slow down Iran's nuclear weapons program. That's the Stuxnet, or Olympic Games, as Julian's colleague David Sanger reported. And there's a huge public policy question here about what is the appropriate use of some of these capabilities and tools. Does the use of these weapons or tools actually just spur a cyber arms race and create, and spur other countries to create their own offensive capabilities, which in fact did happen once Stuxnet happened and the story came out. What is the most responsible use of cyber? I think if cyber could become less secretive, there could be more open understanding and debate about it, we'd have probably much healthier use of that tool, like any other weapon in our arsenal, and would be better probably for all of the countries in the world. That's my position.
Let's talk about identities, moving from capabilities to identities. Identities are among the closest held secrets of the intelligence community. Identities of assets, and intelligence officers have complained of specific cases in which details of a foreign asset, enough details were revealed in the press that that person lost his life. With regard to the IC whistleblower, the New York Times chose to publish certain details about this intelligence officer, alleged home agency, previous service at the White House, expertise on Ukraine. Now, I used to work on Ukraine, and when I did, the number of people that fit that profile was about 1 or 2. So, a counterintelligence officer would say, this is a great gift, thank you. And there's enough emotion on the part of, supporters of the president that arguably you've exposed this person to danger. Was it necessary?
So I would argue that it was necessary. I do want to say this is not something that we did lightly. This is something that we talked to people outside about, that there was a vigorous discussion inside the paper. For me, the reason why this fact, not the identity of the person, but the home agency, was relevant was from the story that we told several hours after our initial report. And it was this, that the CIA officer on the week of July 29th, days after the July 25th phone call, anonymously brought a complaint to the top lawyer at the CIA. And under the rules, under the guidelines, that CIA lawyer called the White House. That means 2 weeks before the CIA whistleblower complaint was filed, the White House knew that the accusations were coming from the CIA. And then the rest of the story that I told that night of what happened to that complaint and how it went from the White House to the Justice Department, how it went into a legal purgatory at the Justice Department, is critical to understanding how the government was ready for the whistleblower complaint to come, what they knew about it. And I don't think that the public is as well informed about the origins, about the seriousness, about the credibility of this person if you don't understand that full story. And it was a tough call, but I do believe that in a matter of vital national interest, an accusation against the president, one that we know from the call transcript has merit, that this is important for the public to understand. I realize that people have different views on that. I've listened to the criticism. I'm willing to listen to more criticism, but I do believe that this was important for the public.
We're going to go soon here to questions from the audience, but I wanted to ask if you all have ideas for improving the situation. We've identified this natural tension between intelligence and journalism, probably necessary. Is there a way, intelligence wishes journalism would be more responsible with the secrets you managed to get. Journalism would like intelligence to lighten up a little bit and be maybe a little bit more helpful from your perspective. A recurring idea I've seen is to actually embed journalists in the intelligence agencies, which I think is nuts. But, and I'd like to hear from Peter Finn, who was an embedded journalist with Special Forces, is if there's any merit to that idea, or any ideas for actually improving the situation, because both of us on the intelligence side and journalism side are in the information business to make things better. And how can we do better in our interactions with each other?
I would see it would be very difficult to embed a journalist in an intelligence agency. It raises all kinds of questions about independence. On our side, on your side, it raises questions about access to classified material. I just don't see it working. It's very different than being in the field with soldiers, which is what, I was wandering around Iraq with these special operators and seeing what they were doing and writing about it, with some limitations. So I don't see any kind of formal structure being set up or being agreed to that's workable on either side. I do think it's good to have a mature, robust public affairs department in these intelligence agencies, something that we have lost in, at least in much of the government over the last 2-3 years. And I think there's an ongoing responsibility on our part to listen to intelligence agencies when they make arguments to us about what should not be published because it's damaging for this or that reason. In the end, I believe the decision to publish or not is ours, and we have to live with the consequences of those decisions.
I just want to say, for one, I'm totally into that idea, and if Gina Haspel is listening, she should totally come and talk to me. I think it would be great. We can make a deal. I could follow her around for a few days. I could go to the, Kabul station. I could go to Baghdad station. I mean, seriously, actually, there's a whole generation of reporters who have done embed after embed in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and we have an understanding of how the military works. We have an understanding of where the military fails. We know what you learn from the staff sergeant. We know what you learn from the general. We know how you move up and down the organization. We know what the organization can do really, really well and where it fails, and that is because of embeds. I've done embeds with Special Operations Force, I've done embeds with regular units, I've done embeds with intelligence officers in the United States military. And I really feel I learned a lot and I helped the public understand a lot. I realize that these are secret organizations, but let's work together and figure out some access.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Pentagon definitely sees its institutional interests as advanced by this sophisticated approach to access that they've developed, and it does cross into intelligence. I mean, they will occasionally walk you into places where, they'll ask you to sign an NDA that you ever saw the screens. I won't sign the NDAs, but I'll say, I promise this is one of those rare times when it's totally off the record, but it's interesting. You get a feel for the entirety of the organization, and there's space. And I think, in a way, when the intelligence services have been led by people who have an understanding of how intelligence must function in an open society, and that the press is part of the constitutional system that they are seeking to defend against all enemies, and that there are sophisticated strategies to distinguish between responsible journalists and criminal hackers, and there are sophisticated ways to defend what you want to defend, while also being engaging in a way that's helpful to everyone. I mean, that we've developed that very informal culture until recently, and so if there's a restoration of that kind of a normalcy, it would be I think possible to take it further. One way that it could definitely be taken further, and there were experiments about this in different administrations, including the Bush administration actually, is declassification of historical records by the agencies, because the keeping of secrets is way overbroad in this country. We don't have a FOIA system that's working the way the law was designed. We don't have a system like they have in the UK, where the 20-year or the 30-year rule really kicks in and matters. And so it's up to the agencies themselves to do what they did in one bespoke case with Peter, but I think more systematically to make their operations transparent and tell their story through historical records.
One lesson I think the NSA learned was back in Snowden, when they were caught very much flat-footed in the initial days after the leaks, and there was just story after story, and they weren't prepared. Their initial instinctive reaction was to hunker down and say no comment, and then they realized they were just getting they were totally looking awful with these stories. So they finally belatedly put together a press strategy, and they really beefed up. They hired staff to be part of this press team. And I remember, because for once, whenever I used to call the NSA, I used to say the press job there is the Eastern world, because all they do is either say no comment or they don't return your call. But after Snowden, I was not only getting my calls returned, sometimes they would call me and say, would you like to speak to the deputy director about this particular program? They were proactively reaching out to try to help me understand the story that we were going to be writing, because the big difference here is that what Snowden gave us was we actually had documents, copies of records from inside the NSA that forced the NSA to have to engage, because they couldn't just say, oh no, these don't exist, and they don't, so therefore no comment, no program. But that is a very rare kind of occurrence, a rare thing, and if that's the only way we're going to get more disclosure and transparency from an agency, I don't think it bodes well. We thought maybe maybe this would become more of a permanent feature and institutionalization, but I would say after about 6 months, 8 months, a year of that, they've gone back to more of their, no comment.
Right, right. Well, I want to give the audience members a chance to weigh in with some questions. There are microphones. Please use the microphones. IHE people will be choosing because I can't see very well. And please limit your questions to actual questions rather than statements. So let's do that.
Director of Security, Senate Intelligence Committee, know this area well, and I love the discussion on competition. So I'm going to use a military term to ask another version of that. There's a battle rhythm. When politics heat up, the battle rhythm increases in this town. So we have a high degree of battle rhythm. Now, you have competition going on among yourselves on the story, but I would like to ask you what effect the 24-hour news cycle on television plus social media does to the battle rhythm, not only in times of tension or great interest, but also in other times, specifically to the case when CNN reported that a highly placed U.S. asset had to be exfiltrated out of the country. They attributed the reason related to the president's discussion in the Oval Office with Russian officials. Later on, that was corrected. But tell me the effect on you on battle rhythm, because you guys are in it for long term. You've got a system, you've got checks and balances to a certain degree within, and you have deep understanding of this business. So I'm interested in how that affects your battle rhythm.
I was working on that story for 3 months. And about 3 days before the CNN report went, I learned that they were working on it. And then 3 hours before they went to air, I learned that they were going to go to air that day. And our story was not ready at that hour, so we did not run it. We did not rush it in. We let the scoop go. Story I've been working on for 3 months with 2 different colleagues now says, as CNN first reported this morning. But we let that scoop go because we didn't think everything was right in what they had. We had a different story. We had a fuller story. Our story was not ready at 8 in the morning or 9 in the morning or whenever they went to air. And we did speed up to publish by the end of the day, but we did not, in that case, I don't know, I would say in no case will we lower our standards. And so that was a painful day as I watched a scoop get away, but that's the nature of the business.
Yeah, I think everything seems more accelerated now and more immediate than earlier periods that I've worked in. But I think within that environment, you have to hew to your own standards. You have to, subject stories to the kind of scrutiny they need before they're published. And if you, as painful as it is, if sometimes you're beaten, you just have to accept that. But it's there's no question that the whole environment, the 24/7 news cycle, the social media, that it's had an effect on us. I think it has. We no longer live in the same world that we lived in 15, 20 years ago, and journalism as a result is different. Back when I was in Kosovo, I would spend a day out in the field reporting, I would come back, I would file the story, and then it would appear in the next day's paper. our people now are routinely filing an early version of a story, then building the story out through the day, then writing it through again for print. And so just the nature of that cycle changes how we do things and what we do. So what we have to guard against is being trapped by the seeming necessity of speed. And that's an ongoing deliberative process, I think, that we have to engage in.
I guess question right in the back, all the way in the back.
Hi, thank you. Want to just express thanks for having everyone here on the stage. It's such a treat and a shame that we just lost Steve. I was just about to compare this to the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young of national security reporters. But I'm a freelance magazine writer, and we don't have the nose really for what's kind of coming next quite like you do. So I was just curious, open-ended, where do you see this whistleblower story moving in the next 2 or 3 weeks? What particularly are you looking at? It's blown open on so many fronts. Is it, what's hiding in these ellipses in the non-verbatim transcript? Is it who uploaded, to the NICE system? There's sort of this proliferating list.
You're answering your own question.
There's this proliferating list of mysteries, and I wonder what strikes you as a distraction, and what particularly are you keen to sort of find out or
Do tell us.
I think the questions you raise are all things we're focused on. We're interested in the complete conversation. We're interested in who decided to put it on that computer and why. What about it when they read it worried them that led them to make that decision. We're interested in other conversations that might have been put on that server.
Julian's taking notes.
There's the larger political question of where this impeachment inquiry goes, how the administration will respond to it. We're seeing the first iteration of that today with the Secretary of State's letter. We could be in for a prolonged legal and political struggle over this. So there are multiple questions that we're all following. And that's what makes it fun to get up every day in the morning, because you don't know what the day will bring.
It's really an interesting contrast to the ops tempo or battle rhythm of the Russia story, the Russia investigation, and how that played out and the impact it had on the American public at large versus this story, and how quickly and intensely this one developed, and how if you look at Russia, what it was 2.5 years of stories and investigations that kind of fizzled out in the end with Bob Mueller's testimony, and this one within first week of the stories breaking, we're now talking about an impeachment inquiry, and so there's just a different resonance, I think, to this story. This one seems to somehow have resonated more with the American public, and it's really a political story, and at the same time, though, there are investigations, and we as intelligence and national security reporters are also going to be digging to understand the deeper underlying story beyond the politics.
From an intelligence point of view, it seems all backwards. Intelligence is what you exercise accountability over, and here we have intelligence being the accountability mechanism over possible abuse of power by the executive. This is not a position that intelligence wants to be in at all.
So a question here. Just hold on a second. We'll get the.
I have two questions. My first question is, how is the constant attack of the Trump administration towards journalists have affected the relationship between the journalists and the intelligence community? And the second question is, when do you decide to go from an informative story to investigative story? And I'm talking about the piece about this double agent and Chinese agent that was very recently in the Washington Post. When I read it, it seemed to me very light. I would like to know more details, and I would like to know how it fits in the general trade.
So
law.
maybe we should just take one question at a time, and we'll take the first question and then go to someone else.
So as to the question about how Trump's constant attacks on us have affected our relationship with the intelligence community, I mean, in a sense, we're both the targets of his attacks. So sometimes, there's a little bond there, common
Misery
bond.
loves company.
Sorry?
Misery loves company.
Misery loves company, right. But, we've grown in a way inured to these attacks. We've been hearing them for 3 years now, more. So we just have to do our job. It's become almost a cliche. But our editor likes to say, we're not at war with this administration, we're at work. So head down and we do our jobs.
I do worry, though, that the place of journalism in society, our relationship with the general public, that it is being damaged, that we're living in an era of agitprop and propaganda and fact-free assertions, and I just think ultimately, we all have a responsibility to educate ourselves, to have a broad diet of news that we read and consume. I think, it is true that we're all sometimes living in our own particular bubbles. And I would urge people to, read the New York Times and the Washington Post for sure, but also you should be watching Fox News. You should have, read the National Review. You should have a diet of media that's both, if you want, mainstream, more marginal, that is specialty on particular subjects, whether it's cyber, whether it's Syria, whatever your particular interests are. You should not be waking up every day and just reading one publication or just watching one TV channel. I don't think it does you any good as a citizen or ultimately as a voter who has to decide on who leads us. But I am deeply, deeply concerned about the tissue damage that is happening as we are all in our partisan corners, and facts and truths are something that we no longer believe in.
So we'll take two more questions over here.
I'd like to pick up on that tissue damage piece, but take it back to accountability and responsibility. You mentioned that there are sometimes other media outlets, particularly in the time of social media and other things, that are not as responsible about their decisions in terms of accountability about intelligence. How do you deal with that? What does that do to you when you make a decision not to publish and then you read it someplace else and you think, words that I probably shouldn't say into the microphone, so we'll leave it to you to respond.
Yeah, I mean, that's an ongoing and difficult thing for us, and it's not like we have a general principle. I mean, we have to look at each situation individually. Let me give you one recent example. The guy who was exfiltrated out of Russia.
Smolenkov.
His name first appeared in Kommersant, I believe, and was provided to them by the Russians, and then it began to circulate. Reuters, The Guardian, multiple other locations. One American news organization went to his home, and we made a decision that at a certain point that his name was, that the tide couldn't be held back, that his name was so public at this point that it was a little absurd on our part to not to name him. There are other instances where we have held back for other reasons. So I think, it is a difficult environment to work in, but we have to make individual decisions each time this comes up. It's not like if, for instance, a media organization tonight identifies the whistleblower, that we will automatically publish his name. We probably won't. But there may come a time when it becomes absurd not to publish his name or not to acknowledge that his name is now so public, everyone knows it. But we will almost certainly have to cross that bridge very, very soon. And we will be confronted with this decision very, very soon. But I think that'll be our position. And we'll weigh those factors. Who published his name first? What happened subsequently? Did political figures then start to name him? All of those things will factor into our decision whether or not we name him.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Full disclosure here. It's good to see you again, Mr. Finn. I haven't seen you seen you since
I'm an infrequent panel.
Yeah, the French embassy a couple of years
Yes.
ago. You remember that?
I do.
Little, with Ruth Marcus. But anyway, my question is this. If any of you up there feel is brave enough to answer, the question is this. Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, and/or Chelsea Manning. Heroes, patriots, scoundrels, whatever you want to. What would you have done if you were in their shoes? Would you have done what each of them had done?
That's not I have never worked in government. I have no desire to work in government. So that's a question I can't answer.
I did work in government for 40 years, and I can't imagine deciding that I knew better than the institutions and the rules that I agreed to when I signed up for government service. So no, I have no sympathy for those individuals.
All right, thank you.
Good. Thank you all for coming. This has been an illuminating discussion. We have food and drink to continue the conversation. But let's thank our panelists for coming out.